Hi, I'm Kirby Allison, and I'm pleased to report that I'm back in London and standing here today on the famous Clive Steps, named after Clive of India, the now increasingly controversial 18th century figure who in 1744 began as an office clerk for the East India Company and would eventually become first British governor of the Bengal Presidency. We're just across St. James's Park from the mall and a mere stone's throw from number 10 Downing Street, which is no coincidence as to why we are here today, which is to visit the Churchill War Rooms. This incredible underground bunker that served as the base for Britain's government throughout World War II and is now a fascinating museum bearing the name of Britain's legendary Winston Churchill. A full 3 years before the war was eventually declared on Nazi Germany by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, it was already apparent that if hostilities were to break out, London would likely suffer unprecedented aerial bombardment. It would therefore be vital to have a safe underground site near the heart of the government from which the Prime Minister and his cabinet could direct proceedings. After a thorough assessment, the basement of this public office building on King Charles Street was deemed to be the most suitable location, and in 1938, the necessary conversion work commenced. The large subterranean area was both fortified and transformed. The Cabinet War Rooms would stay operational for almost exactly 6 years, right up until the 16th of August, 1945, the day after Imperial Japan's formal surrender finally brought an end to the global conflict. With great relief, but with no real ceremony, the lights were turned off and the now seemingly redundant offices were vacated. Thankfully, however, the rooms remained preserved, frozen in time, until in the 1970s, Britain's Imperial War Museum took over responsibility for developing the space. Then, in 1984, this magnificent museum would be opened to the public by the United Kingdom's then Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. It is truly humbling to be stepping back so vividly in what was one of the darkest periods of history for this great nation and for the world, and it is all too easy in hindsight to forget that the outcome of World War II was never a foregone conclusion. So join me as we now enter through the doors to what was the strategic nerve center of the British government during those terrible, terrifying years. Years which would test the mettle of a nation and bear witness to the unwavering resolve of one man, Sir Winston Churchill. Nigel.
Hi, hello.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
Great. Welcome to the Churchill War Rooms.
Yeah, well, I mean, just right at the entrance.
This is important to take on board the staircase, because the depth you see of the staircase, that's how deep you are underground. That's all you've got.
So this is as far as we go down.
That's right. This is a very British place. It's extemporized to make the best of a bad deal.
Okay.
We couldn't afford to build anything special, so we came here into this basement and made it as safe as we could. And that depth, so that's 10 feet, 3 meters, that's all you've got above you, and they make it stronger as best they can in 3 different phases, and then make do with that for the rest of the war.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, it's hard to believe, the nerve center of the entire British government, just 10 feet, below ground and just a stone's throw from number 10.
That's right. Well, that's why they picked this one. They looked around in the summer of 1938. Where can we go and put the British government that will be safe? So if the bomb, or when the bombs come, they were pretty sure they would come. When they come, they don't want to disrupt government. They don't want it paralyzed. They want to be able to carry on. Where can they go? And they looked around at all the buildings in Whitehall. It was too late to build anything new. And they found this above us, which is now the Treasury. This was new public offices. It had been built at the turn of the century. It was one of the strongest buildings. It had a steel frame. It was built of very strong material, and they thought this will be safe. And so they came down into the basement and they proceeded to make it stronger. And as we go through some of the rooms, I'll point out the things that they did to strengthen the basement and make it as strong as they could.
Yeah, and I guess luckily it was never bombed.
It was there very close.
Closely.
Very close. There were 2 bombs which shot in September 1940 as the Blitz begins to roll across London, first in the day and then at night across September 1940. When you come into the entrance, if you're coming to visit the Churchill War Rooms, what you will actually see is just on one corner is the memorial to the 2002 Bali bomb. Very close to there was one of the closest bombs, and just across the way there's a small cafe. In the garden of that, where they now have their dumpsters, that was the first bomb to be dropped in the middle of September 1940. So it comes very, very close. And the war comes to the doorstep of this building and justifies its existence.
Yeah, I can't wait to see it. It's my first time.
We'll go down, I think the first place to go and have a look is the cabinet room, where Churchill's cabinet came to be safe from the middle of September 1940 onwards.
Wow. Wow.
This is the cabinet room. This was prepared and ready from October 1939 for the heart of the British government to come and work safely when the bombs came.
10 feet underground.
It's safer than being above ground,
that's
as they found out. And from the middle of September 1940, when the Blitz really starts to kick in, Churchill starts to use this on a regular basis. And from the middle of October 1940, so about a month into the Blitz, this becomes a regular place. And throughout that winter of 1940-41, this is where he will come with his cabinet, the small wall cabinet, the bigger large cabinet they would invite people to, but also you can see the 3 chairs sitting in the middle here. These are for the 3 chiefs of staff. So the chief of staff of the Army, the Navy and the Air Force, and they will come and sit here and directly confront the Prime Minister because they will hold Defence Committee meetings here as well. And I always think that this tension which exists between the chiefs of staff and the political head of the nation, that is a reflection of democracy, and that's what means that democratic tensions, debate, discussion, they cannot autocratically order one way or the other in the way that Hitler could. And so that tension allows a stable course to be followed, and it's the reason why the democratic nations win the war.
Well, and it really speaks to Churchill's character. I mean, here's one man, up against 3 at one time.
Absolutely.
And I can imagine that tension was, quite thick at times.
Yes, his relationship with the Chief of Staff was, frosty. It was difficult. But the interesting thing is that I would often say to people, when you sit here and you think, in the summer of 1940, what right did Churchill have to say to the British people, work with me, come with me, trust with me, and we will win this war? There was no reason to believe that, but he had that charisma, that power, that calmness, that kind of self-assurance that would radiate around the country. And what's fascinating to me is that this is the chair in which Churchill sat as Prime Minister when he was chairing the meetings here. And you can see here in the handles of the chair, you can see the marks that Churchill has left when he is chairing those meetings. He banged his signet ring with his right hand on here, and you can feel the groove there. And he pulled his fingernails backwards and forwards through nervous tension. And so what you see here on the chair, it's the physical manifestation of that charisma, the power of his leadership that he projected across the nation in 1940 is still manifest in this chair, and that makes it one of the best objects in the museum.
Unbelievable. Wow. And here it is in its original condition.
In the original condition. And so it sits here, and you can see the way in which the cabinet is arranged around the Prime Minister. You had on his left Clement Attlee, he was the leader of the opposition, leader of the Labour Party, became Deputy Prime Minister. On his right is Sir Edward Bridges, who is the Secretary of the Cabinet. He's the Cabinet Secretary in charge of the Civil Service. And from this position, Churchill will then begin to administer all those cabinet decisions and all those decisions in the Defence Committee. And when you look in this room, it doesn't look too bad. But when you start to think about those meetings and what it must have been like, you have to remember that everybody smoked. We know Churchill very famously as a cigar smoker, right, and you can see the Romeo and Juliet cigar sitting in his ashtray. There would have also been pipe smokers and cigarette smokers. This atmosphere in here would have been thick. It would have been blue with smoke. It would have been, to us today in our modern 21st century sensibilities, it would be totally impossible to carry on.
That sounds splendid.
In here, you get this trunking, and this is the only air coming in. It's not air conditioned, it's just pumped, it's filtered, and it comes all the way from Horseferry Road. If you know London, it's probably about half a mile, almost a kilometre
Really?
away. Big pump sent it through this metal trunking, and it was pretty stale by the time it got here.
Why was it pumped so far? What was the purpose of that?
Because at that point they could control it, they could push it, they had the machinery. They built these big rotundas in Horseferry Road as another means of securing the government, and they put the infrastructure in that, and so they pumped it from there. And it was only when they completed this that they were able to move the cabinet into this particular room in October 1939.
Yeah. So Churchill, how many hours a day would he have spent in this room? I mean, how was his time divided between the cabinet room and the other rooms that are a part of this war center?
Down here, he came here specifically for cabinet meetings.
Okay.
And so we have this set up as if it's just about to happen. You can see the clocks in all the rooms are at 2 minutes to 5. The cabinet meeting on the 15th of October 1940 is about to happen at 5 o'clock. Churchill is about to enter the room, the other cabinet members are already here. That's because the night before, Whitehall had been hit by 2 particular bombs in Treasury Gardens, and all the windows of number 10 Downing Street had been broken. And for Churchill, it convinced him that now was the time to come underground for all the meetings. And so from that time on, throughout the Blitz, they came here. And they would come here not quite daily, but almost daily to hold those meetings. He also came here to hold the Defence Committee meetings. So he came here on a regular basis. They would hold their meetings 2-3 hours, and then they would go back to their offices and they would undertake their other work. Yeah. Now, there were lots and lots of other people walking across the Cabinet War Rooms. And so it's not just Churchill and the government. There are the planning committees, there's the intelligence committees, there's all the secretaries who work for the Cabinet Secretariat. All of that work is being done, and it's like a big machine moving it through and churning it out. And Churchill is at the heart of that. And all of those people who knew they weren't completely safe, they knew they were safer than being up above ground. They were inspired by the fact that in amongst them, just on a casual basis, the Prime Minister would walk up and down and go to the various different functions.
And would he enter through those doors I walked through and the steps that I came down?
He had his own flat. Eventually, from the autumn of 1940, he lived in what was called the number 10 annex in this building to put him close to this complex. And so he had a staircase in the middle, and he came down and entered through that main entrance in the middle of the building. But he would come up and down the corridor that we're about to walk down. And one of the key rooms for him in his conduct of the war is the map room. And I suggest if we go down the corridor, we find our way to the map room, and we look at the way in which Churchill can have a sense of that great strategic command of the whole global enterprise that was the war.
Yeah, amazing, wow. And this is just as it was on the last day.
This is exactly as it was left. There are 4 rooms that have been preserved here in what we now call the Churchill War Rooms, then called the Cabinet War Rooms, which in 1948 they were designated a national memorial. And they were exactly as they were shut up at the end of the war, left and kept. And so as far as we are aware, it's the same tablecloths, it's the same chairs. It's not the same blotting paper because that was changed every day, but it's pretty much the same kind of blotting paper. So it's exactly the same room. And one of the things that fascinates me about the room are the maps that you see around you. And this here is a classic map from the 1930s. And it says a lot about the mindset of those people who commanded the war for Britain. Here is Britain, probably twice as big as it really is, sitting at the middle of Europe, sitting at the middle of the world, and from here radiates that sense of confidence and world power which was still here in Britain in 1940 from that vast empire from the 19th century. And so all of those who had been born into that empire, sitting around the table, would have had that belief in its power and its strength, and it's reflected in the notion of this map.
Unbelievable, defending the world from here. Well, where to next, the map room?
Map room, I think we go to the map room.
I mean, it's incredible just kind of how dark it is down here.
And this comes from Downing Street. Wow. There's always a story. Churchill kept his bananas in that. We've been trying to figure out why there is that story, because I don't think he had any bananas. Who knows? This is the map room.
Wow.
This in here, this is truly the beating heart of the Cabinet War Rooms. This is where everything important was turned over and decided. Today we're all used to digital information overload, constant news feed. You know, if you watch CNN, BBC News or whatever it is, you get a main picture, you get a banner, you get a breaking news on the bottom. This is the equivalent of all of that. In here, there was constantly updated information. Seated at the table here, you had 3 duty officers, or 3 map keepers and a duty officer. And they would be constantly taking updated information, putting it out and plotting it onto the maps around them.
Wow.
All the information comes in and is collated and plotted onto the maps. And the clearest map is if we walk around, we can walk and see the naval convoy map, which connects Europe and the United States.
And all this information is coming in, you know, throughout the entire battlefield.
It comes literally from across the world. It's brought in through intelligence reports. On the telephone, you see this bank of telephones, they're all direct lines, they're all connected to the other war rooms of the Admiralty, the Air Ministry, to the War Office, to Number 10, to the Home Security Ministry. It sends in live reports. It gets collated here by these guys and given to the clerks who then plot it on the map. And so we can see it's constantly as up to date as you can possibly be in the 1940s.
I mean, the only real full view of the entire war.
Yep, if you were one of those really senior figures in the United Kingdom and you wanted to know exactly what was happening in the war, you came here.
I can only imagine just the activity in this room. So this is literally the nerve center of the entire war in this room.
Yep, this is where those key members of the control of the war, command control of the war in Britain, they came to get their information. Everything was plotted, collated here, and you can see in the maps, which are left exactly as they were as the war ended. This map in particular is the one that fascinates everybody, because on this they plotted the movement of all the ships around the world, particularly those vital convoys which came from the United States to Europe, in order to bring that information, all the troops, the resources that were needed for the invasion and the conquest of Europe. And you can see just through the maps here where parts of it had literally been worn out and had to be replaced with pieces of paper because they put so many pins to chart the movement of those ships. And this is the state of the war, exactly as they followed it from 1939 all the way through to 1945. And we know that this room was in operation till literally the last day of the war, because behind us we have the 2 weather maps from the 16th of August 1945, the day after the Japanese surrender. And on that day, this room shut, closed, left exactly as you see it, locked up, and this is how we found it.
Everyone went back to enjoying some fresh air and more room.
That's right.
I mean, the number of pinholes here is just absolutely astounding. And this map and how it's, you know, it's just a checkerboard of pinholes, you know, really illustrates how this truly was a world war.
It is a true global affair, and they needed all that information collated and brought here so that when they thought about it, they made their decisions, they were as up to date as it could possibly be.
Wow, amazing, gosh. Wow, so this was Winston Churchill's bedroom here in the War Cabinets.
That was his bedroom and his office. This was given to him in the summer of 1940 as his space. So this is where he came. Churchill had a very particular way of life, and this wasn't going to suit him living underground like this. You can see in the corner there's a basin where you would have had to wash with jugs of hot water. This is a man who had 2 baths a day. He got up in the morning, he worked in bed, and probably about 10:30, 11 o'clock, he would have a bath. His valet would then dress him, get him ready, and he would do most of the day. Then he would go back to bed again in the afternoon, about 3 o'clock. He would get up again at 5 o'clock and have another bath, completely get dressed again and be good for the evening. So a man who liked a lifestyle like that, he was not going to live with a basin in the corner and a jug of hot water.
Wow.
So he had this room given to him, but he only used it a handful of times. We believe he only came in here 3 times and slept overnight.
Really?
In at the beginning of the Blitz. But that's because by the winter of 1940, he had a flat which was literally 5 minutes walk from here. So he didn't need to. He would often have a power nap. The other characteristic of Winston Churchill's lifestyle is that he would have a siesta in the afternoon where he'd put his night clothes back on, he'd get right back into bed for an hour, hour and a half, and that kept him going until about 2 in the morning. He used to exhaust everybody who worked with him. But it's a lifestyle that is quite remarkable for a man who was in his late 60s. Somebody who could power through all the way from getting up fairly late for those days, maybe 8 o'clock in the morning, but he would do a lot of work in bed. He would then have a busy lunch where he'd probably have a few drinks, and then he'd have a busy afternoon, and he'd travel and he'd do things, and then he'd have that power nap, and then he'd come back again and he'd go all the way, and quite often at 10 o'clock he'd say, let's watch a movie. And he'd keep people going. And other people who worked on a regular basis, they'd be just kind of failing by about 10 o'clock at night, but they had to keep going. But Churchill had that personality. People could feel this about him, that he had that energy and that drive. And that's one of the things that keeps him going.
Yeah, he was the man of the hour.
He was the man of the hour, and I think this is one of the key things, why we're still talking about him, why we're still here looking at this in particular, is that he plugged directly into the history of the time. And he was exactly the personality that Britain needed somehow to draw out that survival instinct.
Yeah. So what is this in the corner, this velvet
What we have
jumpsuit?
here, this is one of Churchill's very famous siren suits.
Okay.
Churchill invented the whole concept of what today in the modern world we call a onesie.
Onesie,
It's
yes.
a onesie, basically. Churchill in the
He was a man of cloth.
He was a man of eccentric tastes and a kind of idiosyncratic outlook. Churchill had seen the bricklayers who'd worked at his house Chartwell in the 1930s wearing boiler suits, which was that kind of practical, utilitarian coverall that workmen would put on, all have been doing for decades. Churchill saw this and thought it was a great idea. And so he went to Turnbull Asser, his shirt maker and one of his tailors, and he had them make boiler suits basically out of proper cloth, the same sort of cloth you would have your suits made from. So he had boiler suits which became siren suits turned out of serge. He had them made out of suit fabric.
Like a thick velvet.
And this one is a thick velvet. So if he was going out for dinner, he could still wear his onesie. And so this is a zip-up coverall.
It's like taking the smoking jacket to the next level.
This is why I think he has the velvet ones. This is the smoking jacket equivalent of his boiler suit.
The boiler suit.
And it became a characteristic way in which Churchill dressed for much of the war.
Would he be dressed like that down here?
He could well have been. There are reports of him turning up to cabinet meetings dressing, probably wearing his grey pinstripe version. This one I would have thought is for evening wear, as you say, to go with that sense of the equivalent of a smoking jacket. Maybe he would put it on in the evening if he was going to watch his favourite film or whatever it would actually be. But he had lots of these made for him. But they were proportionally very expensive. Most people would know if you go to Turnbull and Asser, you had them make you a suit. That's going to cost you a lot of money. This is no different. And so Churchill was spending thousands of pounds on these individual siren suits, which he knew for himself as rompers. So he referenced the fact that kids would wear them. So for ordinary people who perhaps knitted them, who made them out of other bits of fabric, they were the kind of thing which, if the air raid siren went off, you could grab hold of it, put it over your clothes, zip it up, and you could then walk away and find your way down to the shelter. So this is why they're known as siren suits. But for Churchill, he wore them anyway. And in fact, when you look at it,
as a romper.
As a romper suit, and they were very comfortable. And when you look at the belt, which is often not on the velvet ones, but on the other ones, it doesn't look so different. There's a photograph of him standing next to Montgomery, who was wearing a battle dress blouse, which does up with a buckle at the side. They look almost exactly the same. By the time he's belted up in his onesie and Montgomery is wearing his battle dress blouse, the look and profile of what they're wearing is very, very similar. So in the end, it didn't stand out, but it was unique to Winston Churchill, and he was very proud of it. And there's some great photographs of him showing us off to Eisenhower, sort of saying, this is the way you want to dress. Eisenhower, I have to say, does not look impressed.
That's right. Wow. Amazing. So this in the corner on the floor, I mean, this ashtray.
Yes.
Like a bucket. I mean, was this really Winston Churchill was smoking this much?
Well, you think of the size and the length of a Cuban cigar. Churchill went through 8 in a day. He was constantly relighting and poking and playing with it. He understood the theatre of a good cigar. He could use it and wave it and point it and do all of these dramatic things with it. And so his detective said he was always keeping one going. And if you do that, you generate ash and then you generate stubs. And so he needed a big ashtray down here. And so you can see the size of it. And it's the same in almost all the rooms you go into. There are these big gargantuan ashtrays because they needed to take all of that detritus from the smoking habit that today we forget about.
It's amazing how different of a world it was back then.
It was a very, very different world.
Well,
and not least of which I think you can see from the size of the bed. Winston Churchill was not a small man, and yet this is a small bed. But this is the bed that he gave.
About the same size as my 6-year-old's bed.
Yes, well, it's a very, very interesting thing to look at this. And we went to look at the Royal Yacht Britannia and Her Majesty the Queen and Duke of Edinburgh. Their bedrooms had exactly the same size bed. So it's a standard bed, I think, from that particular period, whereas today, to us, it just looks tiny.
You get these massive kings.
That's right. And this desk, which sits in the bedroom, which reflects that. It's also his office.
Yeah.
You can see the broadcasting equipment. Originally, this room was the very first cabinet room. So they put the broadcasting microphones in here. And from this room, Churchill made 4 clear speeches. He made one on what was the 11th of September, so 9/11 in 1940, telling the British people to stand by and take the weight of the Blitz because this was Hitler softening us up prior to an invasion. The day after Pearl Harbor, when the United States was brought into the war, he broadcast to the American people from this room at this desk.
Wow.
His wife, Clementine Churchill, who ran the Aid to Russia Fund, she gave a number of broadcasts also from this desk. So this is a place at which literally Churchill could reach out and speak to the world and his wife to tell them what was going on in Britain and connect them with that global war effort on behalf of the Allied cause.
Well, Nigel, thank you so much for the tour. I have to say, as an American, it's really easy to forget how Britain was under constant bombardment by Nazi Germany. We had Pearl Harbor, of course, but other than that, we weren't being attacked on a daily basis. Our government could function above ground, and here the war rooms, as you've so eloquently shown us, were of vital importance to the continuity of government of Britain, to allow them to really persist and to persevere through what was a very dark and trying time for the country.
I think it's very important when you're walking through the site and you're taking it all on board to not just focus on Churchill and the top leaders.
Yeah.
But hundreds of people worked here throughout the war, from 1939 through to 1945, and they were doing very important work, and they knew this. And they also knew that they weren't totally safe.
Yeah.
They were secure, but they knew this was not a bomb-proof bunker.
Yeah.
And so there was a risk every day when they came to work, but they accepted that risk because they were ordinary people doing their bit, and they were proud to be here at the pinnacle of the war effort.
Yeah.
And when you walk through these rooms along this corridor, you see the work being done by the ordinary men and the women, particularly the women on this site. This is a very enfranchised site. From the beginning of the war, both through necessity but also through choice. Yeah. Women were given many different roles, including those of quite senior responsibility. Yeah. And it was a recognition for what was the first time in British society of the ability of women to carry out work at that level. So this was a thriving place. It was full of energy. It was full of pride and power, and people worked those long hours. They put up with the risks. They knew that when they came out and went their way home to their digs, to their flats or whatever it is, were they going to be standing? Would the buses be running? Would they be able to get home at all? They didn't know, because they'd been down here underground. They couldn't see anything. They could hear the sound. But when they came out, they found out what had been going on in their city. Yeah. And this was a shock sometimes to them. And so when you come down here, you have to remember that this is the atmosphere that's embedded in it. And all of those people are as important to the war effort as Winston Churchill. They're all part of that big team. It's like a big machine that turns away. And when you come through the site, we should remember them as well as the man at the top.
Absolutely. Nigel, thank you so much for this incredible tour of what is such an important part of history.
And I think there's probably one more thing I need to show you.
Oh, really?
And that's the way out.
Thank you.